This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with Chris Wickham, professor of medieval history at Oxford University and author of The Inheritance of Rome, illuminating the Dark Ages 400 to 1000. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Today I'm joined by Chris Wickham, professor of medieval history at the University of Oxford, fellow of All Souls College, and the author of both Framing the Middle Ages and the new The Inheritance of Rome, illuminating the Dark Ages 400 to 1000. Chris, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, I've been under the influence of this book for a couple weeks reading it, and so I kind of run the risk of asking questions too inside for someone who maybe isn't familiar with their book or indeed isn't familiar with the Middle Ages at all. But by way of introduction, I would like to ask this about your book. Having finished it, I said to myself, that did not read like an academic book. It wasn't like the academic historical books I've read, nor was it like the popular books of European history I've read. What can you say about the tone at which you pitched this work?
No, it's an interesting observation that you've made. And I think the real reason why it reads like you've said, which is certainly the way that I suppose I hoped it would read, is because I was thinking of it in terms of the kind of lectures that I give to students, the kind of way that I talk to people who actually know nothing about the subject but can be assumed to have a basic interest, but without sort of pitching it in some of the kind of folksy way, I suppose, that some popular history is written. And it was that way that I pitched it mostly because that's something that I know how to do. And I hoped it would work for other people as well.
This folksy way you mentioned now, what does that constitute in your mind? What do you want to avoid when you're avoiding folksiness?
I think the kind of slightly jolly way of expressing things which consists of people who are trying semi-consciously to talk down to a public that they don't really respect. I actually respect the public. I think that people who want to read books about the early Middle Ages normally are interested in being, to an extent, challenged. Obviously not challenged in a way that would make them want to put the book down, at least I hope not. But certainly ways in which they would be wanting to think a bit about what I said, as long as, of course, I've explained it properly, which I've certainly tried to do.
This idea of talking down to one's audience, now, can you give me an idea of how prevalent do you think this might be in specifically popular books about the Middle Ages? Well,
I've certainly seen it. I've certainly seen something that seemed to me like that quite often, and I don't really want to name names, as I'm sure you may imagine.
Yes.
But there's a way in which people think this period is really, really obscure, and no one's really interested in it, so let's try and hype it up in order to make it seem more attractive, but at the same time often make it seem like something that it probably wasn't.
And so it's an effective, I suppose, could we say, how the Middle Ages have been perceived kind of from maybe Gibbon onward, that people think that they need to be framed in a certain fashion before anybody will find it palatable?
Yeah, I think that's basically it. And I suppose my point of view has always been, actually, this is really interesting, and all they've got to do is to listen to me or to people like me, and then readers will see how interesting they are. And that was certainly the standpoint that I was taking all the way through writing my most recent book.
Now, where does this burden come from then? That the Middle Ages, you find them interesting. Obviously, you've just said it. You've written this book, but why has the era come to be viewed as just sort of fundamentally uninteresting?
Well, it may seem slightly paranoid to say so, but I think it's the fault of the Renaissance. From the Renaissance onwards, people have been saying how modern we are. We are modern. Those other people were backward. And in fact, well, it happened in the Renaissance, it happened in the 17th century, it happened in the 19th, it's happened over again in the 20th, that all the time we're posing previous periods as being primitive and us as being the only sophisticated people. And it just doesn't seem a very helpful way to look at the past. And, I would make the same pitch for any period in the past, because I think that all periods in the past are interesting. I just happen to know most about the Middle Ages. But it seems... It's partly that I don't think that we should write off any bit of the past just because we don't happen to live in it, which obviously we don't. But I also think that it's important to recognize that different bits of the past are interesting, just like different bits of the world where people travel are interesting. That they include people who have different ways of looking at things. They include technicolor events which are worth reconstructing for their own sake, and that one can have fun doing so.
Now, is the process of conveying that sensibility, is that something that takes a lot of deliberateness? Or, can you simply approach... did you simply approach writing this book with the enthusiasm you have and kind of let that come through? Or is this something that needs to be sort of carefully delivered? I
did the former. I approached it with the enthusiasm that I had and crossed my fingers, and showed chapters to people to say, did this work or did it not?
And there's a couple elements that you clearly avoided, pitfalls I might say, you avoided falling into, and this is much covered in your introduction, which I was surprised that it was such a clear overview of kind of how history is done. I didn't expect that. But what in terms of, now, besides the issue of sort of dressing up the Middle Ages in a false way to make them seem more exciting, what else is it important for the modern Middle Ages historian to avoid doing, in your opinion? Well,
I spend quite a lot of time in that introduction, and I've done it elsewhere as well, attacking teleology, attacking the idea that everything leads up to what we live in, to the world that we live in, and that the only things that deserve to be studied are the things that lead to our world. I think that's something that lies very, very much in the heart of the way that I think about history. And, of course, it lies at the heart of the way that people write off the Middle Ages, just like they write off, what shall I say, the history of India, because it doesn't seem to lead to the history of the modern West. And so that's something that I've always been concerned to stress. And yes, I thought it was sufficiently important to put in the introduction to a book like this, even though a book like this is aimed at quite a wide readership.
Now, this does seem as a quite fundamentally different way of doing history, of writing history, where you are maybe actively avoiding going through the channels that lead you to portray past periods as merely precedents of what we have now.
I've been criticized for it too.
And I want to ask about that as well, but first I want to say, how did you... This seems so different from any other methods of history that I've encountered. How did you come to that perspective, the perspective that says this is the way it ought to be done?
I don't know. I think I've taken it for granted. I think that actually technical history writing makes that assumption in general anyway. But then technical history writing is often really quite enclosed and works on the assumption that you have to be that you are already gripped by whichever subject the book's about, as all technical writing is. And I suppose what I've done is to generalize that more. But I think really it comes from the experience of teaching students for nearly 40 years who often enough don't really know why they should be studying the Middle Ages, and it's my job to explain to them why they should, and don't know what relevance the Middle Ages has. I mean, the phrase "what relevance does this have" is, I suppose it's more 70s than noughties, but I grew up then, and so I'm used to the idea, and it's implied in the way that I've talked to students for a generation and more, and so it's part of the way that I explain it.
And in explaining that, you obviously wouldn't be saying, well, the Middle Ages are important to study because they are like how we live in such and such and such a way, but nor could you really simply say, oh, because it's interesting, could you?
Well, you certainly can say the latter, and I think that there's some point in saying history is a good thing to study, and if you are going to study history because it's a good thing, you might as well study the interesting bits, and here's one. It's worth studying history not just because it leads up to the modern world, but because it shows you how societies deal with change. And societies deal with change all the time, and often enough they feel ill-prepared for it because they feel that everything should stay the same. It's like everybody has had the experience of people older than them saying that the world's not as good as it was in their childhood. But I mean, I can tell you that people were saying that in 1050, in 550. They've always said it, but knowing how to deal with that is actually a useful thing. Is actually a useful thing to know.
Now, that's something I wouldn't necessarily have expected going in, is that somebody living in 550 would say the world was better in, say, 530, because maybe this is a fault of the popular mindset, but I don't know how much the non-historian thinks of the world as having changed from, say, 530 to 550. That, you might say, is a misperception?
Yeah, the world's changing all the time. I mean, obviously, sometimes it changes faster, and some bits change obviously, technology changes hugely faster in the last century than it ever did in the history of humanity. But other things don't change a lot, or they change in ways that you can't always tell. And the way that the people look back on their lives, that's the moment where they say, oh, yeah, right, that's changed. I don't like that. They say that quite a lot, as I'm sure you know.
The issue of change, of course, is just a huge theme in The Inheritance of Rome, in this period you cover, 400 to 1000. And what I do feel the need to point out, and tell me if this is a correct characterization, and it is something you do discuss, which is that you are not of any of the two sort of narrative positions one might see before on the Middle Ages, in that you don't describe the fall of the Roman Empire as a result of brutal invasions of barbarians and Christianization, nor do you call it a perfectly smooth transition, a total
right.
non-event. Now, how do you characterize your position?
Well, the Roman Empire's invaded. There's no doubt about that, and it's invaded by people who don't call themselves Romans. They call themselves by different names, like Franks and Ostrogoths, which we know all spoke German, or varieties of German, although they didn't. And so it's invaded by people with all these different names and identities. And the leaders of the Roman Empire are actually really quite bad at dealing with them. And they don't absorb them in a way that they could probably have done. They don't defeat them in a way that they probably could have done. But they try to do a bit of both. And it simply doesn't come off. And so all of these groups are invading the Roman Empire because they want to be Roman. They want to be like the Romans in every respect except their own identity. Franks and Ostrogoths, they don't want to give up that. But in so doing, they create a situation in which the infrastructure falls around them, because they do certain sorts of things like occupy the land that the Roman aristocracy had, and they create a situation in which, in the Roman period, you paid taxes to pay the army. In the post-Roman period, the army is sitting on the land, you don't need to pay taxes. And as a result of which, it becomes less necessary to pay taxes, because the classic thing that you spent taxes on ceases to be necessary. And taxes begin to be given away to people, tax concessions begin to be created. The fiscal infrastructure of the Roman Empire folds slowly. It's a slow period of folding. And when that happens, the whole economic system becomes much simpler. And And it's that moment where the whole economic system becomes much simpler that the crushing change comes. I mean, it's a slow crushing change, I suppose one would have to say, but it's like climate change, slow but equally crushing. Now, obviously, all of that isn't really quite as sexy an explanation as Christianization or barbarization or anything. It's a systemic change, but it's a really big one all the same.
I do think, though, that I suppose I would think this, having read the book, having seen this explained, that it is a more interesting explanation on a fine-grained level than are any of the super grand narratives I've heard before about the Middle Ages. And you are no lover of grand narratives, if I'm correct.
I'm no lover of innocent grand narratives. I mean, I actually think history is made up of stories, and you put these together, and they do turn into big grand narratives. You just have to know what you're doing. You have to know why it is that you're saying this, and if it fits into some huge big storyline, well, fine. But often enough, it only fits into that huge big storyline because you decided on it years before you ever came up with this particular bit of the theory. You just have to do it the right way around.
How much pressure is there in academia to do that kind of reversed method you described, where you sort of make your name on a grand narrative and are forced then to hammer everything into it?
Well, not a lot, actually. I at least not in history, or at least not in medieval history. People are a bit insulated from this. Perhaps if you study the 20th century, there might be a bit more. But even then, no. I think that in the kind of university world is a university world that respects really unreadable books. So there isn't all that much pressure to turn yourself into a large-scale, stylish populist. Although you can make quite a lot of money out of it, I'm told. But I'm not expecting to myself.
There is one challenge you talk about toward the end of this book that I was quite interested in, which is, if I have perceived this correctly, the way you seem to seek to portray the Middle Ages not as not as a period totally separate from what came before and what came after it, and yet having to write a book that is about the Middle Ages and really only those. I mean, you have to obviously have a defined beginning and end year. So how do you reconcile those two challenges?
Well, you just got to be practical. I could write a history of the world. I'm not qualified to. That's the trouble. Also, it would go on for thousands of pages and no one would read it. You just have to know that those are your limits and respect them. But I will say one thing, and that is that having those limits affects the way you write. I mean, if you write history of the Second World War that stops in 1943, it's a very, very different book from one that stops in 1945. And both of them are very different books from one that stops in 1948. The whole way that you write it turns from tension to success to tragedy and danger, with you just having chosen an end date. So you have to be very careful about what you're doing. And I'm sure that the fact that I stop in 1000 makes me, at least for the last bit of the book, say it in a different way than if it had been in 1050, for example. It's just the way that cutting it affects it.
How much of a factor was it that you were fitting it into Penguin's 8-volume series of the history of Europe? Was that much of a factor in where it began and ended, or did they have to fit whatever you wanted into their series?
They gave me the dates, but they were dates that I was happy with. I mean, if they'd given me 1100, I could have dealt with that. 400, I think I can't remember now. I think I negotiated 400 because I thought that if you want to understand the early Middle Ages, you have to understand the end of the Roman Empire. But I think that they gave me a manageable frame. After that, I did it. I chose everything myself. They certainly weren't intending me to talk about the history of Iraq, but I thought it was relevant for a history of Europe, and so I put it in.
And that is an element that I did notice. One of the first things I noticed was very different from other Middle Ages histories is that you did in fact include quite a bit from the Islamic world. Why does this strike me as so surprising to see? I feel like it shouldn't, having read your book, but I don't often I don't often see the influence of the Islamic world included in European history.
Yeah, I think that people just don't feel they know about it, and they just don't feel that it's part of their intellectual framing. But I've always been interested in it ever since I was a student, and it's clear that you can make a really good case for feeling that you have to put it into a book like this, because the Islamic Caliphate in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries was ever so much richer, more powerful than anything, than any political system in Europe, and it dominates the Mediterranean world, which is the southern half of Europe anyway. So it's easy enough to make the case, but it helped that I was actually interested in it. I mean, I have to say, I don't speak or read Arabic, which is a disadvantage, but I studied it to the best of the limits of my own ability, is I suppose the best way to say it. But I do think it's important. And I enjoyed writing those bits among the best, partly because it was bits where I was learning more.
What else have you included in here that is not, that you regard anyway as having been under-included in previous histories of the Middle Ages?
Well, an awful lot of histories of the Middle Ages only really include Western Europe. France, Italy, Germany, England. Some of them don't even include Spain. And one thing I was concerned to do was to put the whole of Europe in. And it shouldn't be very much of a plus point to say that I've got Ireland in, and I've got Scandinavia in, and I've got Poland in. But that's more of a critique of the others than it is particularly praising myself. I have to say that too, if you have any listeners who are interested in Poland, there's not a lot of Poland because there's not a lot of evidence. But at least there is a bit. And in the inclusion
of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, now that seems like it would be an important thing for anybody talking about the fall of the Roman Empire to include, because that fell later. You're saying that it hasn't normally been touched on in these histories?
Often enough, no. Often enough, people don't do Byzantium. I mean, it's perhaps comprehensible that they don't include the Islamic world. It really amazes me that people don't include Byzantium on a regular basis. The Byzantium being the successor to the Eastern Roman Empire. It's just the Eastern Roman Empire renamed. But it's something that people don't do. I think that's probably the best way of putting it, and I think they're wrong. So I was certainly very concerned to do it myself.
Is there an identifiable reason for this, or is it just kind of the way it's been done?
It's just the way it's been done. It's partially because the kind of tradition of people like Edward Gibbon wrote Byzantium off. But it's partially that professional historians very often don't read Greek, and that they feel that it's foreign. Well, actually, my Greek's not very good, but at least I can read it. But even if I'd had none, I would have put it in the same way as I put in the Arabs.
And you mentioned Gibbon, of course. His name is one that's always going to come up in discussions of books covering this period, and in the reviews as well. They talk about Gibbon's looming shadow, and I have to know how looming is Gibbon's shadow from your own perspective, doing a book like this.
Not the least bit. I read him in my teens, and I've never read him since. I'm just not interested in it, in the way that he does it. And part of, in fact, you won't find the word Gibbon in the book. I mentioned him now because you did. I prefer not to think of it in those terms. I mean, he talks about the triumph of barbarism and Christianity, which is a really good soundbite for 1775 or whenever it was that he wrote it. But I think we can get past that a bit.
It does seem to me that, I mean, whether or not we're talking about specifically Gibbon, that the view of history, especially that I read in the introduction to this book, and how things do improve as far as how people study history, how people figure it out as time goes by. It does now strike me as somewhat odd that a work of history that old is viewed as still so authoritative in the popular sphere. I mean, is that, am I wrong or right to think that?
I think you're quite right. Why is it so authoritative? Well, one is it's very big, and very big books tend to get given authority whether or not they're any good. The second is it's extraordinarily well written. It's actually it's a masterpiece of style, whether or not you like the content. And thirdly, for the 1770s, it's a really, really scholarly work. But I think the fact that it's really well written is crucial. I don't think there was anything written in the next 100 years about the Middle Ages that was as sprightly. Probably a lot longer than that. So people have read it for pleasure, and they cite it because I think that's my best shot. but even as a teenager, I was so irritated that he got it wrong. But you know, it hasn't sat on my shoulders.
There is another technique employed in your book, presumably not in Gibbon, that did fascinate me, and many people talk about it, which is the integration of texts with archaeological sources. And it does seem that there's more of a balance in your book between the two than I typically see. Now, was that a deliberate choice to include more archaeological evidence than one would normally read in a book of this type, or is that simply your inclination?
It's my inclination. Oh. In fact, I think I actually included less than I could have done, but I was trying to do things like write a political narrative as well, which archaeology doesn't help so much for. I think that archaeology is very, very, very important for understanding this period. And I don't think anybody can really properly understand this period without knowing it well. However, I'm in quite a minority in thinking that. And most of my closest friends and colleagues who work on this period don't really read all that much archaeology at all. I think that they're mistaken, but I know it. I know that that's the case. So part of it, I think, is to show. Part of my aim is to show how not only archaeology can be integrated, I hope relatively seamlessly, into a narrative, but how it enriches that narrative, how it makes certain things clear that weren't clear before if you didn't look at the material world. And that bit was certainly an aim to show that you couldn't really do without it.
And now you say you're in the minority in the archaeological issue of Middle Ages scholarship, and you've mentioned earlier there's been some criticism of your approach to the way to do the history of the Middle Ages. How much of a minority are you in generally now that we're talking about the discipline of history? Because for someone who does not work in history, I could see them reading this book and not thinking you are in the minority on anything, because it seems it's a very solid work. Now, how much heat have you taken for ways you've departed from the norm in this book?
Well, in this book, no, not much. And in fact, I think this book is in some ways my most mainstream book. The thing I'm trying to do in The Inheritance of Rome is to show how you can use the kinds of insights that I have about social history and economic history in order to enrich a more classic traditional or a more classic political or cultural history. I am very much by formation a social historian and an economic historian. I have spent much of my life working on the society of villages in the period between the 8th century and the 12th. And it's something that I know quite a lot about, but it's also something that to a lot of people is quite arcane. And that's not what this book's about. This book's about people like Charlemagne and King Alfred. But I want to show, and this was certainly quite conscious, I want to show readers that in order to be able to understand Charlemagne and King Alfred, and even if they don't give two pins for people working and living their lives in small villages somewhere, that they can't really understand the one without the other.
This does bring to mind, and I don't want to make this a conversation about the things you've avoided doing entirely in the book, but it is notable that there's not a lot of time wasted, at least to my mind, in your book on sort of invoking in the reader, picture yourself standing on the dusty road that I'm now to describe it. There's no attempt to make the reader feel as if they're standing right there, which is a positive thing to my mind. Am I getting across what I mean here? There's a technique.
Yes, you certainly are. I think possibly I'm not that good at doing that. I can do it in a kind of geographical sense, but it would have doubled the size of the book if I tried to give them a word picture of what I don't know, early medieval Rome looked like. I could spend 20 pages on it, but it would have taken you a bit away from the book. But yes, that kind of evoking is something that's probably the work of a different author rather than me. That's possibly my limitation.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Find our complete interview archive and more at colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Chris Wickham, Professor of Medieval History at Oxford University and author of The Inheritance of Rome, illuminating the Dark Ages 400 to 1000. But the being an observer on the level that you put the reader in this book is, I would argue, a better position to be in than the reader who is always being told what the dust would taste like if they were standing right there. I mean, in my opinion, but it does bring something up, which is the threshold of detail that you felt you could go up to but no further. I mean, when do you think you would begin to lose readers? Because there's a satisfying amount of detail here. What line in your mind could you not cross as far as providing additional detail?
I had a space limit.
Ah.
I think that's really it. I have to say, I went amply over my space limit. Penguin would have liked something 2/3 that size. But I really felt that I just couldn't indulge myself in the kind of detail that often enough I could have provided, simply because I had to move on. But again, I think I was probably thinking of the way I lecture, which is you get too stuck in some tiny element and you lose your audience. So, I'm thinking of a bunch of 19-year-old students perfectly willing, but also being really quite prepared to start texting their friends if I seem to have gone too far off beam. I mean, it's that kind of reality check that I was using in my own mind as I was writing.
Of course, there would seem to be a difference here in that even the 19-year-old student texting on their cell phone or what have you, they still, at bottom, want or perhaps need to pass the course, whereas I imagine it's an even greater challenge. Writing a book somebody could always put down and never recommend a Chris Wickham book again. So how much harder does it make that?
It was slightly scary. I was fully aware of it as I was writing. But the only way that I could do it was to do it in the way that I thought best, and to be interested in what I was myself writing as I was writing it, and to have a shot at conveying that sense of interest that I myself felt.
And I do want to talk about the interest that you personally experience here, because there are a few asides that shed light on that. Somewhat amusingly, I thought, in the book. Number one, of course, being the paragraph where you discuss what medieval writers that you have read that you would actually desire to hang out with, and there were very few. Now, what went on there? How many obviously couldn't make the cut in your mind? I mean, is this a world of unpleasant people, the writers that you call on, or what's going on?
Well, I think that the part of it is a lot of the medieval world includes people who believe that it's moral and certainly sensible to be really, really servile to powerful people, and or more powerful people. And I don't really get that. I mean, obviously, I study it, but I wouldn't want to hang around with people who think that. And of course, as you will know, there are plenty of people who still do. So that was, I think, probably the major group of writers whom I cut out. That they were people who really went on about how servile they were, and in the end, there's a certain small number of people who maintain a kind of moral coherence in their dealings with the powerful. Because if you're dealing with writers in the Middle Ages, you're always dealing with people who are on the fringes of the world of power. Because being able to write and having someone wanting to preserve your writings means that you're in the upper echelons of society. But some people actually maintain that they're moral coherent, and good for them. So they were the ones that I was marking down.
And there is a sense, reading your description of the sensibilities, even of those writers who you included, who you did not exclude, I should say, due to their moral incoherence, that you don't seem to be selling the case that these people are just like us. Oftentimes I will read a book and there is that attempt to very often, or maybe constantly, compare these people of the Middle Ages to the ones reading it. And that's not something you're interested in, I take it, to make it seem like they're like us.
I think it's interesting. I think there are two traps. One is to say they're just like us. And really we would have just made that choice, and that therefore everything they do is sensible on one level. And there's another way, which is to say they're so different from us that we really can't apprehend anything about them. I think both of these are wrong. And it's the same kind of trap as saying that the Chinese are inscrutable, the second one. That there's absolutely nothing that you can get out of the way that they think. I do think trying to understand people in the early Middle Ages is like trying to understand people in some quite distant culture now. And you've got to make the effort to communicate with them or to receive their communications. Obviously, you can't communicate with people in the early Middle Ages because they're all dead. But you've got to do it knowing that it's not straightforward. And so I think it's the knowing that it's not straightforward which is the key bit for me, rather than that it's impossible or that it's implausibly easy.
And the issue, of course, of how much evidence there is available for you to even work with. It's clear that in some stretches, as you openly state in the book, often there's not much to go on. But what is the balance to be struck in your mind between being very accurate about the probabilities that something is true or false that you're describing, and the need to give some solidity to a statement so that the reader will move forward, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. I tried in the book not to say flatly things that I knew were only things that I knew could scarcely be established. And from that standpoint, the moments where you have to move into flat hypothesis, I tried to say so on every occasion. The thing about the early Middle Ages is there isn't a lot of evidence, but there is some. There aren't very many bits of the early Middle Ages where everything is really up for grabs. 5th and 6th century Britain is one. The history of the Slav world until the 10th century is another. These are periods in which really you're in the world of hypothesis. But if you're dealing with the Byzantine Empire, if you're dealing with what's now France, there's quite a lot of interlocking material that allows you to say, yeah, okay, I think I can go with this one without all that much trouble. And often enough, you're dealing with writers who you can say quite a lot about, and then you can be reasonably happy with the kind of way that you set it out. So most of the book I'm pretty happy with. I think is probably the best way of putting it.
I did want also to talk about the structure of the book, because when you're not structuring the book necessarily around a grand narrative, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not well, of course, it is chronological, but it goes also society by society.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
How did this develop, the structure?
It seemed to me that you had to, well, obviously, if you're dealing with a 600-year time frame, you've got to divide it up into bits. The first bit is the late Roman Empire, and that kind of speaks for itself, because I really do think that there is a before and after. There is a period in which the Western Roman Empire goes into crisis, and after that it is quite different. But I thought the next real break in the West was the changes that come around Charlemagne and his father and grandfather, who really push the whole of Western Europe into a different direction. So I did a Western Europe before and after Charlemagne. And then then the fourth section is the two great Eastern states, the Byzantine Empire and the Arab Caliphate. So from that standpoint, it divided up reasonably well. And then there's a linking chapter smack in the middle in which I talk about the way that each of them built buildings, and I compare them, so as to try to bring them back together again and make comparisons. And there are comparisons elsewhere in the book as well. But I think it's in that middle chapter when I'm talking about buildings that I do it most. And to all of your potential readers, there are pictures of these buildings too. So
yes,
you
indeed.
can see what I'm talking about.
Picture section there in the middle. Now, did this structure, or did anything about the book undergo a serious change from its earliest conception to the form we see it in now? I mean, was there anything that you had intended on that did not make it to the final product, or the reverse, something you had not intended on that did make it into the book as we have it?
I didn't intend the buildings bit initially.
Really?
It just that there was suddenly a moment quite close to the end where I realized that I really wanted to put it in. And Penguin said, and you've got to have the pictures. And so I spent quite a lot of time with the picture editor trying to find them, and mostly successfully.
I do want to return briefly to the issue of the relationship between the material in this book and the material that you teach. Now, were I to find my way into one of your courses on the same time period, what similarity would I see in what I've read here versus what is being lectured about?
Well, if it was an outline course, you'd see quite a lot of similarity. And one disadvantage of writing the book is that I can't give the same outline lectures any longer because they're all there. I have to do some variation. But if you were doing one of my other courses, you would find that I was talking about local societies, that I was trying to make texts. I would be going through the sources for the period, sources written in the 6th century, say, and saying, how do these work? What do the assumptions of the author tell you? Now, how does that help to understand the period? And that would be the way that I would do most of my detailed courses, even the introductory ones, because you can certainly certainly teach like that in an introductory way. But that requires a level of specific focus on a single text that's not appropriate to a book that covers 600 years.
There is a quality of the book that it is a wide span of geography and a wide span of time built out of fine grains. We've talked about the avoidance of grand narrative, certainly, and the avoidance of big generalizations and stating hypotheses as facts. But it does seem to be like a picture built out of small grains. Now, would it be accurate at all for me to call this, perhaps grandly, as the result of your own interest, which I think you've displayed even here in this conversation, your own interest in the workings of a smaller scale, of smaller societies, the tension between that and the mandate to write this big, large book that covers a very important span of time that people often discuss?
I think that's a very acute observation. And I haven't put it like that to myself, and I will now. I think that is the case, and I think it fits with something that is a feature of the book, which I was quite conscious of, and which I did deliberately, which was that I started every single chapter with a little story of something quite localized and something quite specific, and sometimes was the doing of a king, but sometimes was the affairs of someone of relative insignificance, which I tried to use as a way of getting the reader into that particular chapter.
I do so often hear of stories, whether small or large, as being the way to hook the hypothetical reader, no matter what genre you happen to be writing in. It's always give them a story. And from what we've said earlier, it does seem that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that you've written this book by your own interests, and that you yourself are sort of the hypothetical reader of this book. Now, this book has been out, of course, quite a while in your own country, less so here in the States. But with the reactions that you've so far heard, the reactions in the press, I mean, has that been borne out? Has your own interest been pretty reflective of the way people have received it, or have there been large divergences in the way that you have been interested in the material versus other people find various other elements more or less interesting than you would have?
I think that the reactions to the press have been, well, actually they've been rather nice. I think I'm probably running about sort of 5-1 in terms of really, really quite positive reviews. And they seem to like in it the kind of things that I would have liked in it. I think that is right. I mean, I think it's important to say stories do seem to me to matter. I don't like talking down to people, but what I do like is attempting to tell certain sorts of stories, and it's part of it. It's part of a social history cliche. I remember in the 80s, you would open any history journal, and every single article in it would begin, "It was the 14th of August, 1581. Horsemen rode into the village of X. They were looking for trouble." And then it would sometimes go into quite an arcane and difficult argument, but it started like that, and it's a cliche, but it's also a cliche that works. And so, knowing that it's a cliche, I do it myself quite often, and I'm not really sorry I do.
How much change is there generally in the field of social history? Whenever I hear about it, someone is always, they do always frame it in terms of this is how things used to be in social history. It's not how we do it now, of course. Is this kind of a protean field? Is it all the time changing?
Social history went radically out of fashion in the 90s, and people started to write cultural history instead. People started to write, as you might say, about what people thought rather than what people did. I think that these days the two are coming together again, as more and more people on each side of the social cultural divide realise that they can't do without the other. I'm married to an art historian and a cultural historian, and she said to me, "What's the real difference between the cultural history I do and the social history you do?" And I couldn't really answer. I think that there's a sense in which they've come together.
It's another example, I think. Well, it's been a theme in what we've talked about here is where your own work and the work of some others has come to fall between the various extremes that we've seen in history before. As in terms of the way you portray the fall of the Roman Empire, you fall between two extremes, and the type of history it falls between two wide points on the spectrum. Is there any area in which you are not the midpoint of two threads we've seen before?
Oh, I'm not really the midpoint at all. I'm much, much more interested in social history than most of the other people who deal with this. I'm much, much more interested in archaeology than they are. I'm much, much more interested in peasants, who are 95% of the population of the period I'm talking about. Most of my friends are only interested in Charlemagne, to put it. I mean, that's a caricature, but it's that kind of way. So I don't think they'd see me as the middle of the road. But there's always someone more. I think yes, it's fair to say that there's always someone further out than you are, and you can always point to that someone and say, "Well, I'm not like that."
Now, this book is one certainly. It's a work that incorporates so much evidence that one would not have had access to. Certainly Gibbon did not have access to, but in the past one wouldn't have had access to. It's a modern work in that sense. Now, give an idea to those of us who don't have a lot of experience working with the Middle Ages. How much does it seem as if there is left to still discover, to still know? How much more evidence is there to be able to incorporate? I mean, could a revision of The Inheritance of Rome look quite different 15 years from now? Or what do you think is the probability of that?
Well, there'll be a lot more archaeology. And that's what I also say to my friends who aren't interested in archaeology. There's going to be more It's going to be more unavoidable to talk about it. And archaeology changes all the time. That's the other thing, that you dig more stuff up to the ground you don't expect. And you have to alter your horizons to fit. There aren't going to be all that many more written sources. But what will happen is that people have more sophisticated ways of reading them. And that's always something that you can't predict. And that will mean that quite a lot of the statements in the book will seem too crude in 15 years' time. Well, I hope not in 15, but certainly in 30. And I would be reasonably sure about that.
Is that simply the projection of the way we think today about an older source when we read them and we say, well, the statements they make are perhaps a little bold, not quite nuanced enough, or is it something of a different kind?
I think it's more that people have certainly in the last 15 years, become much, much more aware of the degree to which the way that people write is affected by the style in which they choose to write. So there are certain sorts of things you simply can't say because you've chosen a particular sort of style. Now, what's happened is that certainly a considerable sector of the historical community have realized that and now write really quite enclosed books about the style of particular authors. I mean, in the way that you might if you were writing about Shakespeare. But they haven't then gone and back and generalized out to what that tells you about the society of the period. Or some of them have, but certainly not all of them have. I think there's quite a lot more scope for that interplay between understanding about the style of an author and understanding about what that implies about the society in which he or very, very, very rarely in this period she was writing in. There's still quite a direction to go along that particular road.
And so the insights historians have made about the way individual writers write has yet to be, in a large sense, brought back to the old grand narrative is not a term I want to use again, but the old broader histories that we still rely on? I think that's so. And again, I don't want to generalize about all historians here because it wouldn't be true of all historians. Some historians know this good and well and push it along. And some haven't really figured it, but they are providing the material that will allow someone else to do it. Now, having written the book, has anything changed due to the process in terms of the way you respond to questions about why the Middle Ages are interesting, why the fall of the Roman Empire is interesting, why the end of the Middle Ages even is interesting? Do you respond any differently now that you've gone through this process, or is this simply the extension of what you would have said before?
I think that what writing the book made me able to do was to say it easily without having to fish around in my mind for what I really meant. I wrote in the book, in the statements about what history is like as a discipline that I wrote in that book, I was writing things that I really thought and really had already thought, but I hadn't thought through. And now I've thought them through, it's easier for me to improvise about them. But it hasn't changed my mind about the field. It's just made me be able to express it better. Of course, it would be up to your listeners to decide whether I can express it better. But I wouldn't have been able to have expressed it as well previous to writing the book.
The name of the book, once again, is The Inheritance of Rome, Illuminating the Dark Ages, 400 to 1000, as I would say, or 1000, as you say over there, correct?
Correct.
1000. Chris Wickham, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Thank you very much indeed.
This has been The Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. Our theme music is produced by Ben Althouse. You can check him out on the web at benalthouse.com, and you can check our show out on the web at colinmarshallradio.com. Find the complete interview archive there, plus a lot more fun stuff. If If you have any feedback, positive, negative, or otherwise, please do send it on to Colin@colinmarshallradio.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.